All right. So now we're going to be talking about the illusion of conscious will. We were trying to understand consciousness last time, some easy and some hard problems of consciousness. What if we decide that the problems are too hard and that we should instead be considering some radical alternatives? So we're going to go over that today. I'm going to go through some history and some background, then I'm going to present the idea, and then I'm going to give some arguments back and forth against it. Fair enough? As the recap, I think I'm going to start spending a little bit more time on the recap as we move forward, just because um, all of these issues connect to each other. There's flash forwards and flashbacks. So this is going to connect to modularity in the future. It's going to connect to some of the issues in embodied cognition, some of the issues in evolutionary psychology, etc. But the stuff that you've already covered, it connects to both the Buddhist and the David Humean idea that there is no such thing as a self, that the personal identity lasts a mere thought. All we have are ideas, thoughts, beliefs, and whatnot. Anything that you try to attach to form a bigger narrative is just a story you're telling yourself. It's going to connect to some of the debates that we discussed in the 1800s between whole brainers and people that thought that there were independent mental aspects. This was in some of the early neurobiology, some of the phrenology stuff that we no longer accept, but it still is relevant in that these ideas keep coming up again and again. And then finally, of course, the most recent lecture, what is consciousness? I want to present 4 different views here, and you can have a number of these views with respect to causation and action, right? So when I say, why did I get up to go get a beer from the fridge? And I say, I believe that there was a beer in the fridge and I was hungry. So that's a standard explanation that people give. We would label that a causalist explanation. So the belief, the reasons, and the desire for getting the beer was the cause. On the other hand, there are people that think that no, the actual cause were some neurons firing. It was some synapse connecting, some fact of chemistry or biology or neurobiology or even maybe fundamental physics. That was what the actual explanation. And my statement that I believed that there was a beer, I reasoned that I could go get the beer from the fridge. My goal was to get a beer from the fridge. That's the actual cause. Nevertheless, it's still an explanation to say that I believed that I'm still explaining what's going on, right? So this is a view that not all explanations must be causal. I'll say that again. If you recall early in the semester in the background in philosophy of science, one of the major views was that explanations were causes. That's how you explained what was going on. Some people accept that. And so when you say, I am going to get a beer, that is a cause of the action. Other people say, no, the actual cause is some biological feature, some chemistry, some physics, something. It'd be a really long explanation, or a really long description. So the cause isn't going to be the explanation. The cause is the answer to my question, and it's non-causal. If that doesn't make sense, go back to the philosophy of science reading, or we can talk about it in class. There's 2 alternatives, which might be more difficult to understand. The first one is the idea of a sui generis explanation. So sui generis means of its own kind. And this is the view that intentions are unique. Um, your intention to get a beer from the fridge, you can't analyze it in terms of biology, in terms of causes. You can't analyze it in terms of anything else. It just is, it's its own kind of explanation. And so that's going to have a lot of sympathies with the non-causalist view. There's going to be a lot of overlap there. The minds are unique kinds of things, and we don't need to look at fundamental physics or biology or neurons or whatnot. There's also a dual intention view. And this is the view that, yeah, sure, okay, when I say I'm going to go get up and get the beer from the fridge, there's multiple causes for it. There's multiple things going on. One of them is whatever muscles were twitching that got me to get up. Another one is my belief. Maybe my my memory of beer and quenching thirst, right? So all of those are going to be relevant to explaining that event. And keep in mind, you can have sympathies to all of these. You don't actually need to stake your claim on the ground. These are technically alternatives to each other, but I think the reason they're alternatives is because they have a lot to say about what's going on. Sometimes the kind of explanation you're seeking is, why did I go get a beer? Because I wanted to. In that case, you're giving a sui generis explanation. Why did Billy go get a beer? He had the thought that he wanted it. Okay, so that's maybe sui generis, maybe causal, maybe something. Right, so these are just different ways of describing what's going on. And it's going to be relevant to this issue called epiphenomenalism. So the word epi means on top of, right? Epidermis, that's the top layer of your skin. Epigenetics, on top of genetics. I don't know any words with epi, but phenomenalism, phenomena are events, or in some views, they are what it is like for something to experience something. The idea of epiphenomenalism is that there is a feeling that it is like, or there are phenomena that are not, that are just byproducts of what's actually going on. So on the right, I have a picture of a heart. And I say, okay, the heart is pumping blood. Cool. That is why the heart exists. Our ancestors survived when their neighbors or cousins that had worse hearts didn't, because our ancestors had hearts that could pump blood. Hearts also make a lub-dub sound. Lub-dub, lub-dub. Our ancestors did not survive because our hearts made the lub-dub sound. So we would say that is an epiphenomenon. Your car makes a cool noise when you rev the engine. Steam comes out of a train when it's moving. Those aren't the purpose of, well, for most vehicles. It's not the point. The point is to get the vehicle from one point to another. So those are epiphenomena. When we bring epiphenomenalism to the mind, the idea is that our explanation of our actions, that is our behavior, is produced by physical states, our brains, perhaps, our bodies, some features of biology, but our minds aren't having anything to do with it. Let me say that again. It feels like you are deciding to raise your hand right now, or deciding not to. An epiphenomenalist about the mind will say, no, that's just a story you're telling yourself. the real causes are invisible to you. Why would anybody believe anything like that? Well, there's been germs of this idea for a long time, but the modern way of thinking, or the most recent contemporary way of thinking about this, goes back to some studies from Libet et al. In the early 1980s, where they measured the electrical conductivity, the readiness potential of various participants, and asked them to stare at a clock, well, not a clock, at a very precise stopwatch, and decide to move their arm. And then they would say exactly the moment they decided to do it, and then we would see their arm move. We would measure their feeling of subjective awareness of deciding to make that movement, and then when they actually move their arm. Okay? So one of the weird things about this experiment was, on average, most participants, when you measured them, there started to be activity before they became aware that they were about to raise their arm. So they said, "Oh, I'm gonna raise my arm now." Actually, by quite a few milliseconds, by quite a few hundred milliseconds, like half a second, it seemed like their brain was getting ready. Their body was getting ready to move. All right, so some people found problems with this right away. It turned out that Libet was using average time of reported consciousness instead of the earliest time, which would produce a skewed result. Maybe, okay. Other people said, well, okay, of course there's going to be activity before you decide, but that doesn't mean that that activity was the decision. There's just a storm coming up, and there's a preparedness to make a conscious choice, and your brain is going to get ready, your body is going to get ready, and then you decide to move it. So the idea is, all right, these interpretations are interesting, but no, we don't have to take the most skeptical view, the epiphenomenalist view. Subsequent replications found that even when you looked at only the earliest decisions to move, they all still occurred after the readiness potential became measurable. And in fact, some people started interpreting this as there was no free will, but there was a free won't, because you could measure people as being able to stop themselves, and it seemed like the decision to not move happened right around the time that they measured wanting to not raise their hand, but there was activity before raising it. So it's almost like there was a preparation to decide something, and you could actually at the last second change the trajectory. You just knew that there was going to be a decision. So I think a lot of people found this interesting, and it kind of like faded away. Some people, however, thought that there was a deeper truth to uncover from this. This is a model by Daniel Wegner. This is called the illusion of conscious will. He develops it in a lot of papers and in a book by that title. And the model is very simple. Basically, there's an unconscious cause of your thoughts and an unconscious cause of your actions. It has something to do with your brain. But from your perspective, it looks like your thoughts are causing the action. Right? It appears to you as if your thoughts are causal. You're a causalist. But you're not. All right, so why? Let's try to flesh this argument out as philosophers. Okay. Premise one. If the feeling of mental causation can be divorced from the actual causal process, then they are not identical. All right, this is a conceptual view. Like if you can think about Santa Claus and Saint Nick as being different, Clark Kent and Superman as distinct, then they are not identical. They might be the same person, but they're not exactly identical. People, for example, Lois Lane is in love with Superman, not Clark Kent. Clark Kent is a nerd, Superman is not. All right. This is a kind of argument that some people like and other people find problematic. Okay. Premise two, if they're not identical, then it is possible that they are instantiated through different systems or processes in the brain. You might call them modules. So if they're not identical, then you can actually think about different causes. Yeah, sure, okay. I don't think that that's required, but we can. This can be one to many, many to one, many to many, right? Lastly, the feeling of mental causation can be easily and reliably divorced from the actual causal processes of the body. And this is where lots and lots of examples start coming in handy, where you find people who you can regularly convince them that they've made a decision, that they are authors of an action, when you know for a fact, based on the experimental conditions, that they are not, and vice versa. And if that seems to be true, then it's not quite a Superman and Clark Kent, it's more of a Superman and Batman scenario. Because it's not just accidentally, it's reliably and predictably. Therefore, it's possible that these systems come about through different modules. Daniel Wegner describes it this way. You can either begin that we have with the assumption that we have conscious will, or you can begin with the assumption that we don't. If we begin with the assumption that we don't, then we must explain the common co-occurrence of intention and action. I decided to get up and grab a beer, and I did. Cool, that's weird. On the other hand, if we believe that conscious voluntary behavior is consciously willed, then we have to explain the counterexamples. In either event, we must work to explain the exceptions. What Wegner is saying is that the burden of proof should not be on him that we don't have conscious will. The burden of proof is on everybody, because we have situations where it seems like we will actions, and there are situations in which you can reliably separate your feeling of being the author of your own thoughts from that. So I showed the examples of the Gazzaniga split brain studies where there was some mental confabulation going on, right? People made up stories that they believed in their heart of hearts. The suggestion is that maybe we all do that. So if we are causalists, Wegner argues, if we think that free will is a cause of action, that'll yield frustration. Instead, we might want to go back to Hume or to Buddhist thinking and think that there's not quite as much unity in our minds as we thought that there was. And in fact, perhaps that feeling of epiphenomenalism, the feeling of causal action, causal will, free will, is not necessary. It's just a story we tell ourselves to make ourselves happy, to analyze what's going on. The way he thinks about it, it's an internal checking mechanism. It lets us know what we can control, and lack of feeling alerts us to what we can't control, what surely is not caused by our minds. it would be quite surprising, Wegner argues, if the exact same part of your brain that caused the action was also the part of the brain that gave you the feeling of causing the action. So there's so many examples. We'll talk about clever hands. We've already talked about confabulation, agnosias. Those are crazy, where people are unaware that they're blind or unaware that they're deaf. But simpler things like cognitive dissonance, self-aggrandizement, hypnosis, self-fulfilling prophecies, facilitated communication, autokinetic effect. This is where you can get yourself to like write things or draw things where you don't think that you're actually doing them, but you are. So the top right square and the bottom left square are cases that demand explanation. The experience of will with actual will, that's just how we think about our lives. The lack of experience of will without actual will, that's just, we experience those too. But there are so many cases where these are separated. And because of that, Wegner argues, we should not assume necessarily that our will is causal, that we actually are, that our conscious thoughts are actually the causes. All right, so that's going to be the end of this video. In the next video, which will be a little bit shorter, it'll just be arguments against this.